I kind of like to get out of the office, and I like to walk down to the Red Barn because A, it gets me out of the office, and B, it gives me a little exercise in the middle of the day. But most importantly, it kind of takes me back to the roots of Trek. It's like, here was this idea that my dad had and that Bevel had, more than 50 years ago. And so for me, going back to that barn really reminds me of Trek's roots, and it reminds me of the history. Over the years, I have always wanted to talk to you. And for some reason, I have always been apprehensive to pick up the phone. And I invited you here to come back to Waterloo because we wanted to hear more of the story, because so many people have spent their lives building this company and people want to know more.
I grew up in the bush in Zimbabwe, lived in Tanzania, Kenya, Zambia, South Africa. I was actually born in South Africa, lived in Lesotho. My dad was a civil engineer working for the British Colonial Service. I got a lot of time alone and in the wilderness. I don't think I wore shoes until I was 10 or 11 years old. So I was a wild monkey, kind of like Mowgli in the Jungle Book, until I was tamed by boarding school. Very much modeled on the English style of boarding schools those days, which was beat first and ask questions second. So it was a free time, of course, if you were white and if you were wealthy. One has to keep that in perspective. There were plenty of people who were not white and who were not wealthy and who were very, very poor. And I saw levels of poverty and disease that are indescribable. I was sheltered from it, particularly in boarding school, but I was aware of it.
Yeah.
And of course, in the background to all of this was apartheid in South Africa. So I got to see the transition from what seemed like British overlordship to the rejection of colonial rule, the transition to independence, the guerrilla warfare, the deaths of colleagues in school. My parents relocated to England when I was 14, just before I would have been eligible for military service. So my family moved to Europe. I refused to go to school in England because I had read too many books about boarding schools in England, and I'd had enough of being beaten in Africa. I didn't wish to experience it in England. I traveled to Switzerland by myself, and I sought out a local government school and finished my high school education in French. After going to school in Switzerland, I went to Paris and lived there for 6 years while I went to the Sorbonne University studying French literature. But I wasn't really engaged in that. I wanted to start a business.
Well, my dad went to college. He arrived back at the house 2 days after he started college. He hated it. And he grew up in Elmhurst, Illinois. And my grandmother put him in the car and took him down to the church. She handed him over to the pastor, and the pastor put him in a car and drove him up to Marquette and through the back door enrolled him at Marquette. He was a C student. My father graduates from Marquette. He goes to Mott's Paint. Then he gets hired by Caterpillar, and he and my mom moved to Peoria. And then he gets hired by this company in Milwaukee called Roth Distributing. Roth sold refrigerators and appliances, Amana, Norge, KitchenAid, McCullough chainsaws, a whole bunch of stuff, and they had a Milwaukee location. And so he's at Roth. I think he had been there 6 months. And tragically, Mr. Roth dies of a heart attack. And the sales manager is this guy named Red Schmalzer. And Red is like the super nice guy. He's Mr. Personality. He walks into a room and he just lights it up. And Red saw that my dad was pretty sharp. And so he approached my dad and he said, Dick, he goes, why don't you and I buy the business? The way my parents operated is they lived off my mom's salary and they banked my dad's. And so they had put together a nice little nest egg, but Red told them this is how much money you need. So they needed that nest egg. And then they had to borrow $5,000 from my mom's parents, $5,000 from my dad's parents. And so there's a note, and I have it at home. I have it hung up in my office, and it has a note that he owes $5,000. And then on the back, there's like 60 payments, and they're all checked off. The big guy in Red grew that business, and then they opened up in Minneapolis, they opened up in St. Louis, and then they opened up in Denver, in Salt Lake, in California. And that's where my father accumulated some money to make Trek possible. No Roth, no Trek.
I started looking around for ways of making money. Paris is a lovely city and wonderful people, but it's very hard to make a living there if you're not French, if you don't have roots. It's tough. And so I looked around and I read an article in the New York Times. I have to drive across town to find a copy. And it was pretty exciting to read what was happening in America. And I read that there was a shortage of bicycles. I thought, well, France has got bicycles and America doesn't have bicycles. Maybe I could export some bikes from France to the United States. The Stella Manufacturing Company was an old French traditional bicycle manufacturer. They agreed to supply containers of bicycles. So I traveled to the United States and I drove around looking for bike shops who could buy a full container of bicycles. There weren't many bike shops that could buy a container of bikes. I mean, in those days, that was a huge amount of money. It was like $15,000. But I did find some. I was told that Arctic Cat, the snowmobile company,
Yes.
was desirous of creating a summertime product line. And they invited me to Thief River Falls, Minnesota. I arrived there in midwinter, with no jacket. I got off the plane and I just couldn't believe it. This was like the tundra.
Yeah.
They signed a contract to buy lots of bicycles, thousands of them. It didn't last long. They came to me and asked out of the contract. They negotiated their way out of the contract. And at the same time, somebody said to me, well, if you're in bicycles, why don't you move to Madison, Wisconsin? Because that's where the university is and everybody rides bikes there. And, that's a great place to establish a bicycle outlet. So we started a bike shop in Madison and then expanded it to a second bike store. One of my colleagues who had been in Milwaukee for some reason, I can't remember, he said, you've got to meet this guy, Dick Burke, who's interested in bicycles.
My dad had really fallen in love with running. And Frank Shorter wins the marathon in Munich. And there was like this mini running boom starting in the US. And my dad was on the tip of the spear of the running boom. You know, he had been overweight, pipe smoker, and he gets into running. That was a huge change for him. He had these Adidas white shoes with the green stripes, and he would go out running. And we lived out in the lake country, and he would run around Beaver Lake, 5 miles. People thought he was nuts. They'd say to me, "Saw your dad running the other day." And he was the only guy in the whole county who ran, which kind of tells you something about my dad. He did not take the path well traveled. He took his own path. And I remember he ran the Mayfair Half Marathon. It was like the first race he ever signed up for. And he had me follow him on a bike. So I had my bike and I followed him along for 13 miles, and he gave me this big bag of M&Ms. So if he needed energy along on the run, he would be taken care of. And that's the only reason why Trek exists, is because he knew what running did to him.
So I went to Milwaukee and I met with your dad, and he said, "Well, tell me about the bike store experience." And I said, "Well, this is what we're doing, and we're hoping to expand to Illinois and around the country. We'll have a chain of bike stores." And he said, "Well, that's a great idea. You know, why don't I invest in this opportunity?" I mean, talk about taking a risk on it. I must have been in my early 20s.
Okay.
And your dad would have been 14 or 15 years older. So he knew better.
Yeah.
What was on the market was something that had been adapted to manufacturability, so that whether it was a Japanese bike or a French bike or a Schwinn bike, they were building tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of these bikes.
Yeah.
And they were primarily used for children, or maybe in Europe for transportation. But in this country, it was a toy, primarily. Retail is a different animal. Somebody might, in those days, have gone to a Schwinn dealer to buy a Schwinn. But you didn't go to a Stella dealer to buy a Stella. Nobody knew what Stella was or cared. And the competition was Yellow Jersey.
In Madison, Wisconsin.
In Madison, Wisconsin, exactly where it should be. And I set up nearby. Talk about stupid.
So I knew my dad had met Bevel, and that he had helped finance this bike shop in Madison. And it was a Stella bike shop. And then Bevel wanted to expand the bike shop into other towns. And I think they expanded into Bloomington, Illinois. And I think they had 2 bike shops, and they had plans to expand to other cities. And that didn't turn out to be such a great idea. The bike shops weren't profitable, and it was really hard.
I went to your dad with the news.
Yeah.
Good news and bad news. Bad news is retail doesn't work for us.
Yeah.
This is a disaster.
Yeah.
Good news is we're going to build bicycles if you agree. France is not going to be a viable long-term supplier of bikes for the United States. They just don't get it. Their mindset is all wrong. They don't understand the market. They don't want to listen. They thought about price. They didn't think about quality. And, quality is a nebulous thing. They didn't understand what quality needed to be. Why don't we just make them here? Let's make some really beautiful bicycles.
Yeah.
Handmade.
Yeah.
In America, and people will embrace them. And so your dad, to his eternal credit, credit meaning both ways, financial and moral,
right,
supported the endeavor, and he funded the Red Barn. There was just no industry in rural Wisconsin in those days. I traveled all around this area looking for sort of abandoned industrial buildings and came up with that magnificent establishment. So this wasn't an industrial site, it was a carpet warehouse. I think the closest other site was in Spring Green, and that was kind of far from where your dad was.
Yeah.
I mean, he wanted at least to be within supervisory range of what was happening to his money. Waterloo was great because it was a compromise between Madison and where your dad lived. And we set up shop. Well, this is a very exciting time because the company is being created, initial work is being done, and the future is bright. And it was a very fun time. And one of the most fun things was to say, well, what are we going to call this thing? So we agreed collectively, your dad and I, that we would come up with a list of names.
Yes.
Each of us.
Yep.
A friend of mine was Tom French. Ironically, he came up with the name Trek. He'd been working at the bike shop. He was
In which bike shop?
The Stella bike shop.
In Madison.
In Madison. He was always a kind of an independent thinking guy. So he came up with the idea of Trek. That kind of appealed to me, so I put it on the list.
So it was on your list?
It was on my list, but it was not my invention.
So what else was on your list?
Kestrel. Maybe Odyssey. I can't remember any of the other names, but they were sort of moderately acceptable names. Trek was a great name.
And how about on my father's list?
It was a disaster. I mean, I couldn't believe it. It absolutely reflected the difference between his thinking and mine. His names were American Bicycle Company, Eagle Bicycle Company, United Bicycle Company. You know, I just looked at him, I said, Dick, you got to be kidding me. You're not serious. There's no way we could call this thing United Bicycle Company? How are you going to sell any bicycles?
Yeah.
And he said, well, let me see your list, see if it's any better. It was better. And lo and behold, he saw Trek and he said, well, how about that? He said, and I said, well, it's a South African word and, it means what we're all about. Trek is journey.
Yeah.
And it's not some dude's name. This is not a Sinyard bicycle or a Klein bicycle. This is a Trek. And to his credit, because this is your dad.
Yes.
His instincts say, call it American Bicycle Company.
Yeah.
He's got the money.
Yeah.
He could call it whatever he wanted.
Mm-hmm.
But he called it Trek. There was the beginning of an ecosystem of custom builders in Wisconsin, like Mike Apple, Dick Nolan, Tim Isaacs, crazy cowboys who designed and built their own bicycles with their own names on them. These guys were on the outer edges of what had been done, what was thought of as how to produce a bicycle. They did things their own way and they invented techniques and approaches to making beautiful things. It was artwork. And we knew these guys and hired them to bring their techniques. Dick Nolan, he knew how to design machinery to build custom bikes. And he built very beautiful, very complicated machines to do stuff that put miter cuts and jigs to fit the frames together and ways of holding the lugs and the tubes together while they were being brazed and so on that had to be invented from scratch because you couldn't go to a Schwinn factory and look and see what was being done. We did eventually go to Japan and looked at what was being done and adapted some of those techniques, but they weren't all really adaptable to what was happening here. So somehow we had to figure out how to mass produce the custom-made bikes. So the brazing guys from the brazing company were brought into the Red Barn, along with
the owner of Nikko Lugs in Japan, who flew in. And we had a kind of a confrontation. and the brazing guy said it can't be done because they've got an interference fit. And he said, well, let me show you. And he said, give me a lug and give me a tube and give me a hammer. And so he took the lug and he took the tube and he put the lug on and he hit it really hard with the hammer and boom, the lug went right into place. And then he said, give me a brazing torch. And so he brazed up the lug and it was perfect.
To walk into a dealer and say this bicycle is double-butted Reynolds 531 tubing hand brace with silver rod. This was like a space alien descending. And these were custom-made bikes. They were beautiful because they were custom-made. The problem was that they were custom made. There was a huge dichotomy between high end and low end.
Yeah.
And I mean, we just thought about it that way.
Yeah.
This is high end, this is low end. And low end was I considered junk. That's why the bike show was called the toy show. And so there was always a tension and a struggle between what was custom and what was production.
If you take a look at that first year and you take a look at bicycles, how many bicycles do you think were produced?
Well, we produced in the hundreds and then in the thousands. But I remember your dad was insisting on a goal of 80,000 bicycles. And to me, that was unimaginably large quantity of bikes that I thought would be cheap junk.
Yeah.
Because we wouldn't be able to sell 80,000 expensive bikes.
Yeah.
And so there was this tension between your dad and me.
Yeah.
His vision was for a business.
Yeah.
Mine was for, I don't know, an adventure and artwork. Trek led the way in the early years with touring bikes and racing bikes. Touring bikes were bikes which had long wheelbases and had lots of braze-ons so you could attach panniers and bags. The idea was that you would go touring in the countryside and you'd go camping with your bike. It was more of a European concept that we took further than the Europeans did and made a business out of it.
Yeah.
We were back here on our pedestals pontificating about the way bikes should be and arguing that touring bikes were what the customer wanted, which was true until the customer changed their mind. And mountain bikes hit like a deluge. The real bike riders were in California and Colorado. They lived bicycles and they transformed bicycling and they created mountain bikes. But we were late to the game. And I had to frantically go out to California and basically genuflect before Charlie Cunningham, Gary Fisher, and those guys to sort of make my amends and try and gain knowledge and insight into the mountain bike revolution. See, the whole thing about mountain bikes is a design issue. It's not a manufacturability issue. You know, a mountain bike is not built vastly differently than other bikes. So they didn't represent some kind of new frontier challenge from a manufacturability and design standpoint, aesthetic standpoint. They were a user-driven product, which is the way most products should be. Now we've got two things going on. We've got mountain bikes going on, and we've got new materials bikes going on. Aluminum bikes didn't arise out of a riding experience. God forbid that I would have gotten on an aluminum bicycle to see what it rode like.
Yeah.
These were conceptual.
Yeah.
They arose out of manufacturing, mechanical engineering, materials. Things were getting lighter.
Yeah.
And of the two, I was most interested in the new materials because that's kind of a aesthetic and intellectual thing. We became aware of European manufacturers who were transitioning to aluminum. We knew that other people were doing aluminum frames in the United States,
Yeah.
like Gary Klein and Cannondale.
Yeah.
But we didn't like the way they were doing it. There was clunky, ugly bikes. But aesthetically, not to a rider. To a rider, they were great bikes.
Yeah.
But our perspective was that we could leapfrog into carbon fiber by having lugs and bonding the tubes. Because if you can bond an aluminum tube, you could bond a stainless steel tube, or you could bond a carbon fiber tube. And if you could cast the lugs, and we were by then figuring out how to cast lugs, you could make a very beautiful bike and a very lightweight one. I decided that Trek badly needed to get on this bandwagon. So we created the aluminum project at Trek.
That whole project was a Skunk Works project.
But
Your dad didn't know about it.
Yeah.
And so we got the engineers to put together a Skunk Works project with a really fancy jig that could force all the tubes together at one time. It was very clever. We had some amazing engineers. And so we started building these things. And when your dad found out about it, he wasn't totally pleased.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we were into aluminum, and that was a huge step forward.
That first product, the 2000, comes to market right when I started. It comes in like May of 1984. When do you think the aluminum project really kicked off at Trek?
I'd say 2 years before that.
2 years.
It took a long time to develop the jigs, to source the tubing.
Yeah.
Because the tubing had to be sized correctly, and the lugs had to be designed and sourced. It was a manufacturability issue. But it wasn't a huge project. It was a relatively low-key project.
Yeah.
Until it came together. And it really came together after I left Trek. Once I was down in Janesville and I bought myself a beer. And your dad called me the next week or the next month or whenever my expenses went in.
Yeah.
And he said, you bought a beer and you charged it to the company. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, my problem is not that you bought a beer and charged it to the company. My problem is you bought a Heineken. And I said, well, that's the best beer. He says, I don't care. He says, you drink Schlitz next time. Your dad was a sincere American, unsophisticated, unadorned. He is what he is.
Yes.
And you get what you get. He was as honest as the day is long.
Yes.
And totally sincere. America worships sincerity. Europe worships hard-nosed cynicism. I was a European with everything that entails, which means cynical. That sort of blend of innocence, sincerity, and European flavor was melded together in my relationship with your dad. Your dad was wrong as often as he was right, and he generally admitted it. And I was wrong maybe more often than I was right. But we didn't fight.
Yeah.
We very rarely fought. Your dad was generous. I don't mean financially generous. He was emotionally generous in that he would allow you to have your say, and he would not interrupt or forbid.
I take a look at the first period and I see 1975 and 1976. And I see Dick Burke and Bevel Hogg getting Trek off the ground. And then I see Bevel running that business from 1976 to 1986. And my father was involved in all the big decisions, but it was really Bevel running the business. And Bevel's super talented, and Bevel's a product guy, and Bevel establishes the brand. And that's the foundation of Trek. And then my father comes out to Trek and he starts to run the business in 1986. And without him coming out to run the business doesn't survive. And he comes out and he studies the business for 6 months. And he takes this incredible brand with a great catalog of products, because Bevel had gone through this aluminum development, this carbon development. The cupboards were pretty full.
My vision for Trek was driven by product design, product aesthetics. In a way, an ivory tower take on the way the industry was going and ought to go.
Yeah.
Your dad had a different vision for the company. The goal of building 80,000 or 100,000 or building a huge company was not something that I could embrace. I didn't have the vision that your dad had to build a big company and to build a successful company. So the oil and water mix, or the oil and water amalgam, couldn't stay together. The clash between our visions was too great. And obviously Dick had to have his way because it was his company. Mm-hmm. But I didn't greatly disagree with that either.
Yeah.
It wasn't like it was some life-shattering, realization that, I'm being rejected by Trek.
Yeah.
I knew that the course we were on was not going to deliver the vision that Dick had for the company. So it was a natural, normal, and completely understandable separation of interests and directions. We may have been the first stage rockets that got this thing off the ground. But in my view,
yeah,
Trek really began in 1985 when you joined the company, actually in 84, but when you took over the sales force and you brought your own vision to this company that included bits and pieces of both of us. But it was all remixed and reformulated and recast.
Yep.
But it was your vision. Your direction allowed the company to surge forth, give or take blips here and there and challenges here and there, to become what it is today. There are very big challenges coming. And the important thing is not to be stuck in the mindset of what worked for the past 40 years. because it's not going to work for the next 40. And the big challenge is going to be to find out what that thing is and build it in anticipation of what's going to be needed, not in the wake of what somebody else is doing. You've also got leadership transition because you're not 21 years old anymore. These things are absolutely transformative. And anybody who's not scared in this business is stupid. But if it wouldn't be exciting if they weren't scary. Stick to beauty, hire good, kind people, and be scared. Because change is coming like a tsunami. And you're going to have to dodge and weave and dance and prance to avoid the worst and to conquer the best.
Big Japanese suppliers,
Yeah.
they must have thought these people are bonkers.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Can you imagine the president of Nico Lux coming to visit this little thing?
And that's a big deal.
Look at the carpet.
Yeah. Yesterday we spent time here at Trek and we walked down to the Red Barn. What went through your mind as you came back to Trek?
Well, it was wonderment at what has been accomplished, awe at the people I've met, admiration for the products, the designs, the colors, the graphics, the things that always excited me. To see bits and pieces of myself. Excuse me. Excuse my emotions.
Trek doesn't happen without Bevel. Trek doesn't happen without Dick Burke. But then there are other people, and you just keep going through the list, and I'm talking about people all over the map. That's Trek. It's turned into something that everybody can feel part of the family and everybody can be incredibly proud of. Milton Friedman in the 70s, he was an economist, and he basically said this. He said, the object of a company is to make as much money as you possibly can, and that's it. My dad, he didn't grow up with a lot of money, and he got a couple lucky breaks, and during his lifetime, he did a lot for thousands of people, but he sets up this foundation, which does a lot of good for a lot of people. And I go back to that quote about Milton Friedman, the responsibility of a company is to make as much money as it possibly can. That was not my dad. And that's not Trek. As Trek has become bigger, as Trek has become more competent, our ability to create change and our ability to do great things has multiplied. We have a long way to go, but we're on that journey. Somebody once said this to me about a person. A successful life is if you reach your potential and you give back to others. And I think about Trek in that same way. Are we reaching our potential and are we giving back to others? Are we being an example?